The Purple Death by W.L. Alden. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Purple Death by W.L. Alden. Last winter, I occupied a small villa in one of the towns of the Italian Riviera. To me, it is a very delightful little town, partly because it is extremely picturesque, and partly because it is as yet almost unknown as a health resort. You can live there without constantly hearing the cough of the consumptive, and when you do meet an occasional foreigner, he does not instantly begin to discuss the condition of his bronchial tubes, or to inquire as to the state of your own lungs. Thank heaven my lungs and bronchial tubes are perfectly sound. My only trouble is insomnia, and it was for this that I sought the perfect repose and stillness of my sleepy little Italian town. There was but one other foreigner in the place, so I was told, and as I was assured that this foreigner was phenomenally strong and well, and was, moreover, a German, and hence presumably unable to converse with a man wholly innocent of any knowledge of the German language, I did not find fault with the fact that he was to be my next-door neighbor. I saw him in his garden a day or two after my arrival, and was struck by his singular resemblance to the portraits of von Moltke. Although he looked to be at least 70 years old, he was tall and straight as an arrow, and his face, which had something of the firmness and rigidity of sculpture, was that of a man in perfect health and of an indomitable constitution. Even if I had not already heard him called the Professor, I should have known him at first sight as a man of culture. Intense thought and unremitting labor had chiseled those clear-cut features. I made up my mind that, instead of avoiding him, I should like to make his acquaintance, and I found myself hoping that he could speak English, or that, at all events, I could understand his French. Twice during the first week of my residence next door to the German, I saw, after midnight, a light in his garden, and heard the sound of a spade. It is one of the advantages of insomnia that the patient learns to know the things of the night as well as those of the day. Had I been able to sleep as soundly as other people, I should never have noticed this mysterious midnight lantern, or had my hearing sharpened sufficiently to note and identify the sound of a spade. What was the professor doing at so late an hour in his garden? Clearly he could not have been engaged in gardening or ditching. Even a German philosopher would not be capable of getting up at 1 o'clock in the morning to plant cabbages, or to improve the drainage of his garden. The only plausible explanation of his conduct was that he was engaged in burying something which he had reason for burying secretly. I knew that he lived absolutely alone, without a single servant. Hence, he could not be a murderer who made a practice of burying his victims at night. Then again, he was a scientific person, and, of course, had no money for safekeeping in the earth. The third time that I saw my neighbor's lantern in the garden, I discovered that I had an object in life, which was to find out why he dug in the earth at an hour when, as he supposed, all his neighbors were asleep. The mystery solved itself a few days later, and proved to be disappointingly simple. The arrival at my neighbor's door of a hamper of rabbits, and another of guinea pigs, showed me at once that he was engaged in studies which involved the death of numbers of those unhappy little animals. Of course, when his guinea pigs and rabbits had fulfilled their mission in life, it became necessary to bury their remains, and the professor wisely performed this task at midnight, in order not to offend the prejudices of those curious people who believe that vivisection is merely a form of vice in which inhuman men indulge, purely for recreation. I had seen the professor, and I could have sworn that he was a kindly and gentle man. If his guinea pigs and rabbits were cut down in the prime of life, I felt sure that they died in the interests of humanity, and their fate gave me no pain. My acquaintance with the professor, whom I will call Professor Schwartz for the reason that it was not his name, grew up gradually. We began by exchanging polite commonplaces over the garden wall, and I found that he spoke English perfectly. We were both methodical in our habits, and were accustomed to smoke in our gardens every afternoon at about the same hour. Gradually we passed from the discussion of the weather to more interesting themes, and finally the professor accepted my pressing invitation to come and inspect a plant growing in my garden, of the name of which I was ignorant. When I returned his visit, I accidentally discovered that, like myself, he was a devotee of chess. That put the finishing touch to our acquaintance, and we fell into the invariable habit of playing chess every evening from 7 to 9. I found him extremely interesting. He was a physician, though he had long since ceased to practice medicine, and he had devoted himself, so he told me, to the study of bacteriology. He was, moreover, a man of wide culture, and there seemed to be hardly any subject of which he had not a more or less thorough knowledge. But what charmed me in the man was his kindness of heart. His philanthropy was not bounded by any of the limitations of race or creed. The sufferings of the poor touched him as profoundly, whether they were Germans, Italians, or Frenchmen. His love for animals was unmistakable, in spite of the fact that he daily inflicted tortures on the unfortunate subjects of his experiments. I had a collie, between whom and Professor Schwartz a deep affection sprang up, and the man was never so happy as when the dog sat by him with its head resting on his knee. There is no reason why I should hesitate to say that Professor Schwartz came, in time, to be sincerely attached to me, for there can be no doubt of the fact. I wondered that such a man should live so completely alone, but once, when I spoke of the matter to him, he gravely replied that a man should live for the benefit of others, and that his studies were of much more importance than his pleasures could possibly be. One day my collie came into my room, evidently suffering the greatest agony. He was swelled out to twice his ordinary size, and he had hardly sufficient strength to drag himself to my feet, where he lay moaning. My first thought was of my neighbor's medical skill, and I rushed over to his house and implored him to come to the aid of the poor dog. The man came instantly, bringing with him a huge bottle of some disinfecting fluid, and showing an agitation which surprised me in one who had spent so much of his life as a practicing physician. The dog was dead when we reached the room where I had left him, and the professor instantly poured the entire contents of the bottle over the carcass, and then sent me for his spade. When I returned, he carefully removed the dog's body to the garden, and buried it, exercising the greatest care not to touch it, except with the spade. Then he went to his house, bidding me remain in the room where the animal had died, and when he returned, he disinfected the room, and everything in it, with chemicals that caused a thick, but entirely respirable smoke. To my inquiry as to what was the matter with the dog, he merely replied that the animal had been poisoned, and asked me if I had seen the dog digging in his garden. I had seen nothing of the kind, but I saw that the professor suspected that the animal had dug up the remains of some guinea pig or rabbit that had died of an extremely infectious disease. This explained the elaborate care with which disinfectants had been used, though I could not but think that my friend had been unnecessarily alarmed. I had been acquainted nearly 2 months with this mild and lovable vivisectionist, when one evening our conversation fell upon anarchism. The usual bomb had just been exploded in Paris, and I was expressing a good deal of indignation at the miscreants who did such things. "The anarchist means well," replied Professor Schwartz, But he is hopelessly stupid. He attacks the wrong people, and he uses absurdly inefficient weapons." "What do you mean by saying that he attacks the wrong people?" I asked. "Just what I say," he replied. "The anarchist wants to kill men who have money, capitalists and small or great shopkeepers, and employers of labor. These are the very people who are most necessary to the existence of humanity. If the anarchist tried to kill laboring men, he would be working for the emancipation of the race from poverty and misery, but he cannot see this." "I hardly see it myself," said I. "Do you mean that the true way to lessen suffering is to kill the sufferers?" "Yes and no," said Professor Schwartz. "My dear friend, listen to me. All the poverty on this earth is the result of overpopulation. Why does the Italian laborer work for 2 francs a day and spend his whole life in a state of semi-starvation? The anarchist says that the laborer is oppressed by the capitalist. This is rubbish. A man works for 2 francs a day because there are so many workmen that the price of labor is wretchedly low. Halve the number of workmen, and you would more than double the wages of the remaining ones. The same thing is true of the men in this town who make a miserable living by raising vegetables. Each man has a little morsel of ground, and he can hardly raise enough to keep himself from starvation. Reduce the numbers of these small proprietors 1/2, and you would double the amount of land which each one would cultivate, and thus double their aggregate incomes." "That sounds very mathematical," I answered, "but I haven't that sublime confidence in figures that I had when I was younger." "Any man who sees things as they are must admit," continued the professor, disregarding my interruption, "that the world is horribly overpopulated. If a pestilence should sweep off 2/3 of the workmen in Europe, the survivors would be able to live in comfort. Now the anarchist doesn't see this. He would kill off the capitalists, the very men who employ labor, and make it possible for laborers to live. I, on the contrary, would not harm a single man who has money to pay to others, but I would remedy this fatal overpopulation, an evil which grows worse and worse every year. Your English Malthus had a glimpse of what was coming, but he did not foresee what the remedy would be." "Then there is a remedy?" I asked. "Yes. Did I not tell you that the remedy is to reduce the working population? The man who discovers how to do this most swiftly and effectually will be the greatest benefactor this world has ever known." It rather amused me to hear this man, whom I knew to be gentle and tender-hearted, actually insisting that about 1/2 of the population of the globe ought to be murdered. But I thought little of it at the time. I knew how fond some men are of propounding bold and startling theories, which they themselves would be the very last to dream of carrying into action. Here was a man whose business in life had been to heal the sick, and so to prolong the existence of the weakest specimens of the human race, and now he was saying that the extermination of millions of healthy, vigorous men was the one thing that the world needed. It was another illustration of the inevitable bee which, sooner or later, gets into the bonnet of every scientific man. I have said that Schwartz lived completely alone. A man in good health can do this, but if he is taken ill, he soon finds that he must depend on the help of others. One afternoon, Professor Schwartz did not appear in his garden, and when I went to his house in the evening, he did not come as usual to open the door. Suspecting that he was ill, I went to the other side of the house, where I knew his room was situated, and called to him. He answered, but without showing himself at the window. He was not quite well, he said, but assured me that he would be able to see me the next day, and that in the meantime he should want no assistance. He would not consent to see me, and I went back to my villa somewhat uneasy, and half determined to break into Schwartz's house the next morning in case he still refused to open the door. That extreme measure, however, did not prove to be necessary. When I called at his house in the morning, he opened the door and invited me to come in. He was looking wretchedly ill, but he assured me that his attack was over and that there was not the slightest cause for uneasiness. He took me into his library and tried to converse with his usual ease. The attempt was a failure, and I saw that, besides being weak from the effect of his illness, he was both preoccupied and troubled. Finally, I asked him frankly to tell me what was the matter, and to permit me to be of any service that might be possible. He remained silent for a little while, and then he said, "My dear friend, I have made up my mind to trust you. My illness has shown me that it is no longer safe for me to keep my secret absolutely to myself. I shall die suddenly and possibly very soon. In that case there must be someone who will know how to prevent the catastrophe which would otherwise happen to this pretty little town where I have spent so many happy hours. Give me your word that what I shall tell you shall remain a secret so long as I live." I gave him the desired promise, rashly, as I now know, but without dreaming of its nature. He rose from his chair and told me to follow him into his laboratory. There was nothing remarkable in the appearance of the place. I had once before seen the laboratory of a bacteriologist, and it closely resembled Professor Schwartz's laboratory, except that the fittings of the latter were rather more elaborate and complete. On one side of the room was a series of shelves filled with carefully sealed glass tubes containing what I assumed to be gelatin. Schwartz called my attention to these and said, "If you should find me dead or dying some day, I want you to take every one of these tubes, break them one by one in a bucket full of the liquid which you will find in yonder glass jar, and then bury the contents of the bucket, glass and all, in the earth, not less than 4 feet deep. Do this with the utmost care, making sure not to break a single tube except under the surface of the liquid. Otherwise, I cannot answer for your life. You perfectly understand me?" "Perfectly," I said, "and I will promise to carry out your wishes. The tubes, I presume, contain the microbes of various diseases." His face lightened up with the glow of enthusiasm. "They contain the microbes of diseases," he replied, "but the diseases are nearly all new. They are inventions of my own, and some of them are infinitely more deadly than any disease known to the medical profession. You remember the death of your dog? The poor fellow died of a disease which is absolutely new, and which kills in less than 6 hours. If that disease were once introduced into any city in the world, it would spread so rapidly that, in a week, the place would be depopulated." "I do not understand what you mean by newly invented diseases," said I. "How is it possible for a man to invent a disease?" "Allow me to sit down," said the professor, "for I am too weak to remain standing. The answer to your question is very easy. Certain diseases are produced by certain microbes, and hitherto bacteriologists have confined themselves to trying to discover the specific microbe of each disease, and then to discover a remedy that will kill the microbe without killing the patient. No one but myself has ever tried to develop the deadly powers of known microbes. Look at that tube numbered 17. It contains the microbe of typhoid fever, but I have cultivated it until it will produce the disease in 24 hours after the microbe is taken into the system, and will kill the patient infallibly in 12 hours more. That is only one of the dozen similar successes that I have obtained. Then I have crossed different microbes, or rather cultivated them together, so that they have become capable of producing a new disease, partaking somewhat of the character of each of the diseases which the same microbes, if cultivated separately, would produce. It was I who invented, in this way, the present variety of influenza, by crossing the microbes of malarial fever with those of pneumonia. I was living in St. Petersburg at the time, and I accidentally dropped the tube containing the germs of influenza. Someone must have found it and opened it, for when the influenza broke out, I instantly recognized it as my own invention. I have always heard, I ventured to remark, that the influenza is a disease which has appeared in Europe several times during the present century. There have been epidemics of a disease called influenza, he replied, but they differed from the present one. They lacked the symptoms of malarial poisoning, which are characteristic of my own influenza. I have always been very sorry that I lost that tube, for an epidemic of influenza can do no possible good, and does great harm. But to come back to what I was saying before we spoke of influenza, look at that tube number 31. It contains microbes that will produce a disease having some of the characteristics of hydrophobia and some of those of dropsy, while it also has symptoms which are entirely new. It was one of the earliest of my new diseases, and would certainly be very efficacious, should it ever become epidemic. I have, however, invented other diseases which are far superior to it. Here is a tube, he continued, taking it almost lovingly in his hand, which contains my chef d'oeuvre. The microbes are a cross between those found in the venom of the tuboba, the most deadly of all known serpents, and those of the Asiatic plague. By the way, I am the first man to discover the existence of microbes in snake venom. I call the new disease which these crossed microbes produce the purple death, for the reason that the body of the person who is attacked by it becomes purple before death. It kills in less than 30 minutes, and there is no remedy which has the slightest effect upon it. As to its infectious qualities, it is the king of all diseases. If I were to break this tube while we were in this room together, you and I would be dead within an hour, and from this house the infection would spread so rapidly that in 2 days, at furthest, not a human being would be left alive in this poor little town. Think what would happen were we Germans to use these microbes in our next war with France. A single bomb filled with the purple death, and thrown within the lines of a French army, would render a battle an impossibility. Before 6 hours were over, there would not be left in an army of 400,000 men survivors enough to bury the dead. The man's eyes sparkled with pride. His weakness had almost vanished while he was talking, but suddenly he sank back in his chair and feebly begged me to assist him into the other room. When he was lying on the sofa and had somewhat regained his strength, I asked him what possible good he expected to accomplish by adding to the number of diseases which already afflicted humanity. "I have told you," he said, "that I am a philanthropist, only, unlike other philanthropists, I have intelligence and, I hope, the courage of my convictions. You have heard me say that all the poverty and misery of the world are due to overpopulation. Well, I have there in my laboratory the remedy for this evil. I can, with merciful swiftness and with absolute certainty, reduce the population of Europe to a half or a third of what it now is. I have only to take my purple death and scatter the teeming gelatin on the sidewalk of the most crowded street of your London. It will dry quickly, and under the trampling of hundreds of feet it will become pulverized, and the particles will float in the air. That very day the physicians will find themselves in the presence of a disease wholly unknown to them, and against which medical science can achieve nothing. In a few days London will be silent. The working classes and the poor will be dead, and everyone who can possibly fly from the stricken town will have fled. When the pestilence has spent its force, we shall hear no more of the unemployed workmen in London. There will be more work than workmen can be found to do, and the very street sweepers will receive wages that will permit them to live almost in luxury. Or say that I wanted to decrease the population of Berlin. I simply place some of that gelatin in an envelope and send it through the post to the head workman in some factory. He opens it, and the Purple Death breaks out among the workmen. Nothing can stop it until it has run its course. Of course, a percentage of capitalists and employers of labor will fall victims to the disease, but its ravages will be chiefly confined to those who have not the means to escape from the city. Did I not tell you that the anarchists select the wrong victims, and that their favorite dynamite is absurdly ineffective in comparison with the weapons that I can use? Now you see that I told the truth. Man, the lives of half Europe are in my hands." I made no reply. The vastness of the man's horrible scheme stunned me. I had not the least doubt that he spoke the truth, and I had promised to remain silent while his devilish project was carried out. Presently he resumed. "I do not want my weapons to fall into hands that would use them ignorantly. That is why I've asked you to destroy every one of those deadly tubes, in case I should die without having been able to do it myself. I made the discovery yesterday that I may die at any minute, and I am physician enough to be sure of what I say. If I should find myself dying, and should have the time and strength to act, I should set this house on fire and blow out my brains. So if you should happen to find my house burning, you will take no measures to check the flames. But I fear that I shall not have the time to do this myself, and so I rely on your help." "How long since you invented the Purple Death?" I asked. A troubled look passed over Schwartz's face. "Nearly 2 years ago," he replied. "Why have you delayed to use it?" I asked, a sudden hope that the man was not quite so mad as he seemed to be springing up within me. "As yet it has killed no one besides the guinea pigs, except your dog," he replied. "The dog must have been digging where the guinea pigs are buried, and so contracted the disease." "But why have you not carried out your scheme of depopulating the world during these 2 years?" "My friend," replied the professor, "I am not so strong as I believed myself. The truth is I have lacked the courage to begin the work. I have been like a surgeon whose nerves will not permit him to perform a painful operation, although he knows that it is the only means of saving the patient's life. But I shall delay no longer. I may have very little time to live, and besides, now that I have told you all, my secret is no longer safe. Oh, I do not for an instant doubt your word, and I have perfect confidence in your friendship. But when a secret is known to more than one person, it is no longer a secret. But I will have more courage. In another week I shall be as well as ever, and then I will begin the work of redeeming the world from poverty. Now I must ask you to leave me, for I must try to sleep. By the by, you will find a duplicate key of my door hanging on a nail in the hall. Take it with you, and don't hesitate to use it in case of necessity." I left the professor and returned to my house in a most unenviable state of mind. I had not the slightest doubt that what he had told me was strictly true. Granting that the man was mad, and surely no sane man could have calmly proposed the murder of hundreds of thousands of unoffending men, still, the death of my dog was sufficient evidence that Schwartz's claim that he had invented microbic poisons was true. I had given him my word to remain silent. If I kept my promise, I should be accessory to the crimes which he unquestionably meant to commit. If I betrayed him, I not only broke my word, but I made it certain that either he would be condemned to a madhouse or would be sent to the gallows. I could not determine what it was my duty to do, and I spent a night of more terrible anxiety than any criminal ever spent, who knew that the gallows awaited him in the early morning. All night long, and far into the next day, I ceaselessly debated the question of what ought I to do. Towards noon, not having yet heard any sound of life in my neighbor's house, I took the key, and, entering, went up to his bedroom. He was lying in bed, with the bedclothes drawn up close to his chin, and I spoke to him, but he did not answer. When I touched his forehead, I found that he was dead and cold. He had evidently died soon after going to bed, for the body was already perfectly rigid. I did not lose a moment in destroying the tubes in his laboratory. I placed them carefully, one by one, in a bucket filled with the disinfecting fluid which he had shown me, and broke them with a blow of a marble pestle. When this was done, I carried the bucket into the garden and buried it deep with its contents. I should then have been ready to send my servant to notify the authorities of Professor Schwartz's death, had it not been for one thing. The tube containing the purple death was missing from its place on the laboratory shelf, and I had been totally unable to find it. So long as this remained above ground, all that I had done was comparatively useless. Doubtless, the tube would be found by the officers whom the syndic of the town would send to search the apartment and take charge of the dead man's effects. Then it would be broken, purposely or accidentally, and the frightful consequences that Schwartz had predicted would be inevitable. I searched every corner and cranny of the house without finding the tube. Finally, I began to hope that the professor had himself destroyed it, fearing that he was near his end, but that he had been unable to destroy the rest of his poisons. Comforting myself with this solution of the mystery, I went to his bedside to smooth the bedclothes before sending for the police, and in doing so, I found the purple death clasped firmly in his hand. It was impossible to loosen the dead man's grasp, and, after vainly making the attempt, I gave it up, fearing to break the tube in the effort. I called my servant, and told him to go first to the village doctor, and afterwards to notify the police, and then I sat down to await events. The doctor arrived promptly, and proved to be a very intelligent man. I told him the whole story that the professor had confided to me, with the exception that I did not hint at the use to which the dead man had proposed to put his terrible inventions. The doctor found no difficulty in believing what I told him, and it evidently gave him a profound respect for his deceased confrère. He agreed with me that it would be dangerous to meddle with the tube which the corpse clasped in his rigid hand, and promised me that even if an autopsy should be necessary, he would see that the tube remained undisturbed. I think he was a little shy of coming too closely in contact with the body, lest the professor should have died of one of his new diseases. At any rate, he decided to accept my theory that Schwartz had died of heart disease, and persuaded the syndic that an autopsy would be quite superfluous. Professor Schwartz was buried within 24 hours, with the purple death still in his right hand. The police were easily persuaded that it contained some holy relic, and that it would be impious to meddle with it. When the funeral was over, I left the place as soon as I could pack my boxes and surrender the lease of my villa. I have never seen it since, and never want to see it. On the way back to England, I passed through Berlin, where I went to see an eminent bacteriologist, and asked him how long microbes enclosed in a tube containing gelatin would retain their vitality. His answer was, "Forever, so far as is at present known." That answer has poisoned my whole life. 6 feet underground, in the grave of Professor Schwartz, lies the Purple Death, waiting until the day when the cemetery will share the fate of all cemeteries and be cut up into building lots. Then the tube will be exhumed and broken, and the pestilence that is to sweep away the teeming millions of Europe will begin its work. Sooner or later, this is morally certain to happen. I have sometimes thought of exhuming the coffin of Professor Schwartz and searching for the fatal tube, but to do this would be to invite the catastrophe which I dread, for in all probability the tube has become unsealed by this time. My only hope is that an earthquake will some day bury the cemetery too deep for any spade to reach the grave of my poor mad friend. The Purple Death by W. L. Alden. Read by Warren Kati.
A Kiss for the Conqueror by Clyde Mitchell. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Jessie Percival. A Kiss for the Conqueror by Clyde Mitchell. From our innermost planet to the farthest reaches of space, 1 man plus 1 woman equals, well, read Mr. Mitchell's story. "Tonight's the night," Bulger said. He ducked his head to catch a glimpse of his face in the particle of mirror hanging on the barrack wall. It was a lean and hungry face, the hollows in the thin cheeks disguised by the 3-day growth of stubble. He could see Sergeant Pulley's sneer reflected in the glass. "You think I'm joking?" Bulger pushed the long black hair over his ears with the palms of his hands. There were few combs in the world. "I think you're nuts," Pulley said from his bunk. He was wearing a ragged t-shirt. The metal, with its shrieking eagle green with rust, looked ludicrous pinned to his chest. But Pulley wouldn't part with it. "We'll see," Bulger said grimly. "Can I use your razor?" Pulley shrugged. "Once more won't matter. I'd give 1,000 credits for a straight edge and a strop." "Fat chance," Bulger said. He peeled off the coat of his gunmetal gray uniform and flung it on the bed. Then he went to the brown-spotted sink and turned the only faucet that worked. The trickle of icy water that emerged ran copper. "Ion gun," he said crisply. Pulley extracted the device from his waist and tossed it to his barrack mate. Bulger ran a count on the water. It was clear. "Razor," he said. Pulley threw that too. The metal was as rotten green as the man's eternal metal. Bulger looked at it disgustedly, running a thumb along the blade without breaking skin. "Couldn't cut lard," he said with a snort. But he started the painful shaving process. Pulley watched in fascination. "You really got it bad," he said wonderingly. "Taking a chance like that for one lousy kiss? What's so hot about this dame?" "I can't explain it. She's a looker, but it's more than that. I've been watching her parade around, swinging her little—" He cut himself and swore. "I stopped to speak to her once. There was something in her face. That same kind of thing you see in all their faces." "Yeah," Pulley said bitterly. "I know the look." "Do you?" The other man turned around. "What do you see? Hate?" "Yeah, what else?" "No," Bulger shook his head and stared moodily at himself in the sliver of glass. "It's not hate anymore, Pulley. The hate died out of him a long time ago. Right after the war. Right after the contamination. They hate us," Pulley said flatly. "I don't think so. I think it's something different now. Something worse." He began to shave again. "Contempt," he said. Pulley's right hand balled into a fist and struck his knee. We should have killed 'em all. We should have wiped 'em out. I asked her for a match, Bulger said dreamily. Just a lousy match. She stared at me like I was some kind of microbe. Then she wraps her damn cape around her face like she didn't want to let me breathe on her. His growing anger caused his hand to tremble. He cut himself a second time. So you're going to kiss her? Pulley sneered. Why don't you throttle the gal? Why don't you beat her up? Or haven't you got the guts? Bulger turned the anger on him. Watch yourself, Sergeant. Pulling rank. It was a jeer. Shut up. Pulley swung his boots to the bed. Okay, pal, he chuckled. Have it your own way. You're asking for the same amount of trouble whether you kiss her or kill her. I'm going to kiss her, Bulger said vacantly, dabbing at his face with a grimy cloth. I'm going to wait for her by the mess hall. She comes out of quarters on Barton Street every night around 10 o'clock. She cuts across the square, over to Pitcher Street. It's pretty deserted there that time. I'm going to jump out and... Operation Kiss, Pulley laughed, toying with the medal on his chest. The last victory of the war. Bulger slipped into his coat. The unbleached cloth was shabby and threadbare, but the buttons were still bright and gleaming. The insignia of the 505th Army caught the light in the room brazenly, the iron hand clutching forked lightning. He had medals, too, and they jangled as he buttoned the coat up to its tight collar. At least, he thought, his medals were worn where they belonged. My, Pulley said mockingly, you look pretty, Lieutenant. Where's my cap? On the hook behind you. Bulger put the cap on his head, squaring it. He stepped back from the glass to determine its correctness. Beautiful, Pulley said. All right, knock it off. What time is it? 20 to 10. Better get going. Your girlfriend's waiting. I'm going, Bulger said, strapping on his watch. He clanked to the doorway of the barrack, but turned before going out. This place stinks, he said. We gotta clean it up one of these days. Sure, Pulley said lazily. He flopped over on the sagging bunk and turned his head to the wall. Have a good time, Lieutenant. His chuckle ended in a yawn. The area was deserted, just as Bulger knew it would be. He walked quick march towards the mess hall, hoping that he would be unobserved, regretting now the cluster of medals on his uniform. He knew that these tokens of battle were officially frowned upon, but he also knew that there would be added satisfaction in crushing the hard bits of brass and iron against the girl's heaving chest. He ducked behind a building when he heard footsteps. 2 women passed him, speaking in low tones, their skirts rustling in the silence of the night. He held his breath until they were gone, and darted out from concealment, walking more rapidly towards his destination. The mess hall wasn't 100 yards away from the wire fence that marked the safety limit. Even from where he was, he could see the red-lettered sign that warned Conqueror and Vanquished alike away from the radiation-contaminated zone. Bulger suddenly remembered that he had forgotten his ion gun. The thought troubled him only slightly. He had more vital things on his mind. It was an odd revenge he was after. The mess hall was a looming black shadow, facing the rows of sagging-roofed shacks that stretched out for 1/3 of a mile. It was their quarters, seedier, uglier, far less equipped to withstand the brutal weather than the barracks, yet somehow warmer, friendlier, happier-looking. He hated the sight of them. He dived into the enveloping darkness behind the mess hall, stealing a look at the illuminated dial of his watch. He began his vigil. In a few minutes she would appear. Time went slowly. Then he saw her. She was giving murmured goodbyes to the people with whom she visited night after night. Now it was time to go, 1/2 an hour before the sound of curfew. He saw her arms adjusting her cape over her head in the age-old motion of women. Now she was walking hurriedly away from the shack, across the square, her low heels slipping on the loose gravel. There was a moon, and its light struck her face gently, softly highlighting the sad loveliness of her features. When she was some 20 yards away, Bulger started after her. He walked lightly on his toes. She didn't hear him until it was too late. His hand went out, and his fingers whipped the cape from her shoulders to the ground. One arm snaked her waist, the other arched smoothly in front of her. But she was struggling, her foot kicking out forcefully. Just a kiss, baby. He leaned over her, laughing, and replaced the hand over her lips with his own hungry mouth. The kiss was savage. Beyond the force of love or sexual appetite, it was a blow, a crushing onslaught, a blitz of the emotions. "You animal!" she cried. "Listen! Help!" she screamed. "No, you don't understand! Stop!" she shouted. He turned around, frantic at the sounds that were gathering behind him. He saw the figures coming towards him. When the hands closed around him, he went limp and silent, and allowed himself to be led away. The tribunal took action quickly. The guards, with their rifles firm against their chests, looked at him with neither hate nor animosity. The judges were less dispassionate. Lieutenant Bulger? He stared over their heads. Janice Damon? The girl stepped forward, still sobbing. Yes, she said. He's the one. He's been watching me. I know it. I've seen him hanging around the quarters. The woman in the silken uniform looked solemn. You were given many privileges, Lieutenant, she said crisply. But it would seem that men, she said the word with loathing, must always take advantage of their privileges. Do you have anything to say? He shook his head. It's greed, you know, the woman said confidently. The other women of the tribunal nodded in agreement. Greed's the downfall of all men. How many wars do you have to lose before you realize that? He said nothing. Send him to the breeding camp, the woman said carelessly. He'll pay for his kiss. She looked at the girl sympathetically. Your lipstick's smudged, dearie. End of A Kiss for the Conqueror by Clyde Mitchell.
The Soul Ray by Don Robert Catlin. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Dale Grothmann. A Weird Scientific Story. The Soul Ray by Don Robert Catlin. Professor Latour surveyed the young man through thick lenses. Yes, he said. The young man shifted from one foot to the other. Are you the man who advertised? Yes, murmured the professor. I had almost forgotten that I should be expecting answers to my advertisement this evening. Please step in. He waved to a leather-covered armchair near the fireplace. Make yourself comfortable, sir, while I finish the experiment with which I was engaged when you rang. The young man crossed to the chair and sank into its deep seat. He gazed around him, noting that the professor had gone into a kind of alcove fitted up as a laboratory, small but complete. From time to time, bright flashes of dazzling blue light came from the alcove, but the applicant for the strange position advertised by the professor sensed that the other was covertly watching him, and he evinced no curiosity concerning what was going on in the alcove. After a short while, the professor joined the young man and stood beaming down upon him through those thick lenses. You have a reason to believe that you fulfill each requirement? He asked, indicating the neatly clipped square of paper which the young man still held in his fingers. The other nodded, smiling. His eyes fell to the advertisement, and he reread it. Wanted, man to assist in experimental work. No special experience required. He may be of any age, but must be a single man. Must be prepared to bury himself in his work, and have no intercourse with the outside world while engaged in my employ, which may continue for a year or more. Professor Jules Latour, 1081 West Street. Well, sir, I am a single man, and I am prepared to, bury myself in my work. May I ask what? The professor was looking into the young man's face with an air of deliberate and penetrating scrutiny, a trick which scientific men seem to acquire, perhaps from constantly peering through instruments. His gaze seemed to have a paralyzing effect, and the other could not help shifting his chair a little so as to turn his face partly away. As he did so, his eyes fell on a large glass vessel, which he had not noticed before, standing in a corner. It was shaped like an ordinary wide-mouthed bottle, but it was the enormous size of it which arrested his attention. He had never seen a glass vessel of such large dimensions, for it must have stood nearly 4 feet high and was broad in proportion. He could still feel the professor's eyes upon him, and he went on. I am Tom Savage, sir. May I ask what kind of experimental work you are carrying on? Ah, you would like to hear. Behind the professor's thick lenses, his oddly shot eyes gleamed with the enthusiasm of a fanatic. Look you, sir, yonder in my laboratory. Do you see the body of that kitten in the stoppered glass jar? Would you be surprised to hear that I had separated its soul from its body? The young man started. Why, I hardly know what to say. I hadn't known that, cats had souls. Neither had I, sir, until... But I really mean what I say. I have actually materialized a perfectly visible, though intangible soul. You saw those bright blue flashes a moment ago? They were rays of a new kind discovered by myself, which I call soul rays. Any ordinary substance exposed to the light of those rays becomes absolutely invisible and leaves no trace on the sensitive photographic film. I had been testing several kinds of metals when a most singular phenomenon occurred. On developing one of the films before which a tube of mercury had been exposed, I was astounded to find a perfect image of a common housefly. The film was otherwise a blank. I killed a fly and set it in front of the apparatus, and the film, when developed, was blank. The thing was a mystery. Was it only living things that were visible under the rays? Trembling with excitement, I caught yet another fly, this time alive, and secured it in a test tube. To my immense delight, the film now showed a perfect image of the fly. I tried with other insects, and the results were always the same. The live ones gave a perfect negative, the dead ones a blank. You may imagine my excitement over the discovery, for it seemed to prove that there was something substantial about life, something not visible to the naked eye, but which must be present under the rays. The next step was to discover the precise moment at which the dead body of the animal became invisible. Owing to the nature of the rays, it is impossible to observe the phenomenon directly with one's eyes. It was necessary, therefore, to arrange for a series of photographic exposures, which was made possible by means of a motor-driven motion picture camera. I placed the fly in a tube to which poisonous gas could be introduced at will, and set the camera in motion. A splendid series of negatives was the result, clearly demonstrating the fact that the insect became suddenly invisible immediately after the entry of the gas. That was to say, at the moment of death. "A marvelous discovery, sir," said Tom Savage, "but, about this position. It is quite necessary for you to understand something of my discoveries before we can intelligently discuss whether or not you will enter my employ," interposed the professor. "Yes, it was a most marvelous discovery, but a closer examination revealed a still more curious phenomenon. On the first negative after the body of the fly became invisible was a series of dark, round spots. On each successive film exposure, the spots were a little higher, until they at last vanished beyond the upper edge. I then put a spider in the test tube, killed it, and the spots were again on the film, ascending as before, but now they were more numerous. Could it be possible that the spots represented the life of the insect leaving the inanimate body, and that the number of spots corresponded to the scale of life in which the insect existed? I experimented with a canary bird only yesterday, and this evening the subject was a kitten, which you may still see in the glass-stopped bottle. Presuming, as it seems to be the only possible deduction, that these spots actually depict the soul escaping from the lifeless body, it would seem that the insect world is represented by round-shaped spots, or organisms, and the emanating spots in the case of fowls and mammals are, respectively, square and hexagonal. The number of spots may, as I have already suggested, be explained by the position in the scale of life, held by each creature. You follow my argument, sir?" As the professor spoke, he leaned forward toward the young man and fixed his precise eyes upon him. Savage felt himself start as if waking from a doze, though he had clearly been conscious all the time of what the other had been saying. "There is one experiment," went on the professor, lowering his voice to a seductive whisper, "which is indispensable before I can be really sure of the value of my discovery. It is to get a record of what happens in the case of a human being." The young man could not restrain the feeling of repulsion at the cold-blooded manner in which the experiment on a human being was classed with those which had been made on lower forms of life. He felt now, rather than saw, a pair of gimlet eyes fixed upon him, though his own gaze had wandered in the direction of the enormous bottle in the corner. The enormous bottle in the corner. It was large enough to accommodate a human being. The professor again began to speak, a strange and sinister emphasis in his voice. "You came here in answer to an advertisement which called for a man who was single, and therefore had no close ties to bind him, and who is ready to bury himself in his work, assisting me in an experiment. I am doing you the honor to permit you to be an active participator in one of the most marvelous discoveries in physiological science. You will remove the stopper, enter the large bottle. I will prepare my apparatus. Your demise, my dear sir, will be entirely painless, I assure you." An overpowering influence seized upon young Savage. He found his dragging feet were carrying him slowly, but surely, to the immense glass bottle. Never had life seemed so well worth living as now, when he knew that in a moment, if the professor had his way, he would be as stiff and lifeless as the kitten whose carcass still lay in its enshrouding little glass bottle. "It will soon be over," said the professor, divining his thoughts, "and I expect I shall get a splendid series of negatives," he added in a tone of repulsive callousness. An unquenchable spirit of revolt arose within the young man's breast, but he had fallen under the spell of the professor's words, and, try as he might, he could not resist the effects of the mesmeric trance into which the other had thrown him. He found himself being lifted, inch by inch, up the polished side of the great jar, until its sharp rim rested against his spine. Suddenly, the encircling arms were loosened, and he toppled backward into the yawning mouth of glass. He lay bruised and breathless at the bottom of the jar, while the professor adjusted the heavy glass stopper. The air seemed to grow more and more stuffy. Had the poison fumes begun to enter? Every pulse in his body seemed to throb and race in a wild desire for life, and he exerted a tremendous effort to get to his feet and push out the stopper. But an unknown mastery held him in check. His breathing had no doubt exhausted some of the air inside the jar, and the partial vacuum had. The sight of the scientist busy manipulating the apparatus spurred Savage to further exertion. Though he strained with all his might and main, he could but beat feebly with hands and feet against the smooth walls. Then a strange and pungent odor filled his nostrils, and he knew that the end had come. In a half-conscious, half-spasmodic, superhuman effort of his dying agony, he hurled himself bodily against the side of the jar. The scientist was obviously wrapped in a trance of enthusiasm that overstepped the boundary line of sanity and entered the realms of frenzy. But as the doomed man in the jar pounded madly for freedom, his expression changed. The last impressions limned upon Tom Savage's conscious brain were distorted visions of the professor swiftly striding toward the jar, some blunt instrument raised above his head as though to threaten, to force him into passivity. Then, as his eyelids closed, he caught the last clear sight of the scientist as he stumbled. Came a ringing crash to his deafened ears. When he awoke, he lay sprawled half within, half without the now shattered glass bottle. His hands and face were covered with a warm, sticky substance, which he knew to be blood. But he still lived, and so he scrambled to his feet and stood motionless for a moment, staring wide-eyed at the recumbent form of the professor. The scientist lay crumpled where he had fallen, a victim to an overworked and overexcited heart. They thought Tom Savage a madman when he stumbled into the nearest police station and told his bizarre story. He was held in custody while the officers investigated his singular tale, but eventually he was released. Though many experiments were made, no one ever succeeded in solving the mystery of Professor Latour's soul ray, nor could anyone discover its curious properties. But the photographic records of the wild evening remain, and are still an enigma to the scientific world. The most valuable part of the professor's collection consists of a roll of motion picture film depicting a man in curious, distorted attitudes. They are clear, sharp-cut impressions, with the exception of the last few feet of film, in which the human form is only faintly visible, but above the head, though still attached to it, is a ring of bright points, like the halo of some medieval saint. The End of The Soul Ray by Don Robert Catlin.